Berggruen Governance Index. My name is Anastasia Lukaidis-Sideris, and I'm the interim dean of the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs. So on behalf of my colleagues at Luskin, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to UCLA. And before we continue, I wish to note that as a land-grant institution, we at UCLA acknowledge and honor the Gabelino Toca people as they were the traditional land caretakers of the land upon which our campus now stands. The UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs advances the cause of human well-being through evidence-based research and training. We bring together scholars in public policy, in urban planning, in social welfare, at 3 departments, and very soon in global public affairs, to tackle complex issues in a comprehensive manner. An important goal of my school is to help policymakers and governments improve the quality of life for people, families, communities, and cities. So we align very well with the Berggruen Institute's goal, and I'm quoting here from their website, to create a better world where people have an opportunity to live a life of productivity and joy. Unfortunately, society has no shortage of challenges. Universities have no shortage of challenges. These challenges that societies have sometimes threaten the lives, the safety, the prosperity, the happiness of their people, and especially the most vulnerable groups. But how governments behave, what they do or do not do, matters in how we address these challenges. The 2024 Berggruen Index gives us important global and regional metrics about the triad of democratic accountability, state capacity, and life quality. And in compiling the index, my colleagues, Helmut Anheier and Joseph Saracino, and other fellow researchers show that government quality varies widely across the globe. Alarmingly, they also find that democratic responsiveness to citizen desires is in some global retreat, with more countries, as they say, autocratizing over the last decade than democratizing. The Berggruen Index points to the essential lesson that democracy should not be seen in isolation, as the quality of governance can mediate between democratic accountability and the provision of public goods. But the index's findings also significantly moderate the notion that increased democracy would necessarily lead to increased prosperity, calling for a new realism in assessing government performance and a more protective policy approach in global public affairs. Ultimately, the quality, the effectiveness, and the responsiveness of governments largely determines their citizens' quality of life. And the Berggruen Index goes a long way towards helping us assess the progress, stability, or deterioration of governments around our globe. You will hear much more about the index, so I would now like to leave the podium to my colleagues, Professor Helmut Anheier, who is a professor of social welfare and public policy and former dean of the Hertie School, and Dr. Joseph Saracino, who will present. He's the project manager and data scientist, and they will give you some of the most major findings for the Berggruen Index. So thank you, and help me welcome Helmut and Roger.
Thank you very much, Anastasia. You've given us a very succinct summary, so we could actually almost go straight to the discussion. But let me first of all introduce the team. Here we have Joey Saracino, who's just here next to me, and then we have Ted, who is a researcher at Oxford and Hertie, and Regina List, who is the editor of the report. Now, these are challenging times for democracy, right? And for much of the 20th century, it seemed that autocracies would always lag behind democracies for reasons that I will spell out at a moment. And what we seem to observe is that these autocracies and illiberal regimes seem to be catching up when it comes to quality of life. And of course, that is exactly what worries us in this report. We're not the only ones, of course, who come up with disconcerting findings. VDM has just published a report a few weeks ago. As you can see, more countries are autocratizing than democratizing. Freedom House said that democracy is declining for many, many years, has been declining, and the Economist Intelligence Unit tells us that less than a tenth of the world population lives in full democracies. And what we would like to do with the Berggruen Governance Index is put these developments in a context, and we do that with what we call the governance triangle, where we have 3 dimensions, and that you will see here. State capacities are the quality of government, the quality of democracy or democratic accountability, and public goods provision or the quality of life. And we operationalized these with a series of indicators and sub-indicators, and did that over 21 years, covering 145 countries. So we have a fairly good picture. And I'd like us to first look at how we approach this mass of data, right? And point you at the beginning to what is the conventional wisdom, which assumes that democracies are inherently better at performing and providing public goods than autocracies. Autocracies are subject to elite capture, they're more corrupt, there is more self-serving elite behavior in there, and over time that should lead to a lower quality of life. However, we find that that relationship does not hold. And almost the opposite seems to be true, that about half of the countries that are experiencing increases in quality of life, so better public good provision, also show declining democratic accountability scores. And that is a map that should all make us think about the state of the world's democracy. So we are digging deeper into what is going on here, and we are putting forward 2 theses. And each of the theses relates to what we call a fallacy. So the first one says that countries with high levels of democratic accountability, even if they don't have robust state capacity, will be able to provide public goods at a higher level in the long run, right? And so the assumption here that democracy is almost necessary and sufficient for a higher quality of life. And if you believe that, then you can, in fact, commit what we call democratic fallacy. On the other hand, we have the democratic sufficiency thesis, which says that what really matters is sufficient state capacity. And if you have that, you have a higher quality of life. But is that actually possible in the long run? And we will speak to these 2 theses and the fallacies they imply later on after we had a look at the data. So the key puzzle that we try to get at is the assumption that democracy is necessary for providing public good true or not, and under what circumstances? And could it then be that countries can develop economically without democratizing, right? So could the China model, or what is called the Beijing consensus, be part of our global future? So that sets the stage, and I'm now turning over to Joey, my co-conspirator, who will show us some of the key results.
All right, everybody. Thanks so much. So as Professor Onheier has set up, we're going to move to some of the preliminary or some of the main results we find. Focusing specifically first on public goods provision, as this map illustrates, we find pretty substantial variation in public goods provision throughout the world. All regions, as we can see, contain high-performing countries, though the highest scores are concentrated primarily in North America, Western Europe, East Asia, parts of Latin America, and Oceania. This compares to countries scoring like in the middling positions between 30 and 60 in public goods provision, which are located almost entirely in the global south. We see further concentration when considering countries in the lowest tier of scores, those being located primarily in Central and West Africa. And to get a sense of where we've been and kind of understand to get to the point where we are now, here's the long-run trends specifically for this index. So running from 2000 to 2021, we observe that Africa has experienced the greatest incline in terms of its scores. Focusing specifically on the percentage change, compared to 2000, Africa experienced the biggest percentage change amounting to about 66%. This is followed by Asia at around 21%, followed by the Americas, Europe, and Oceania. And now moving to our second index variable, democratic accountability, we find that there's pretty substantial global variation again, though it's somewhat different in terms of public goods provision. Whereas Eastern Europe and Asia performed highly in public goods provision, we find that they don't appear so much so in the top performing countries. Rather, there's a lot more concentration elsewhere. So the data reveal that much of Africa actually stands in a middling position alongside those aforementioned regions, Eastern Europe and South Asia, and along with the lowest performing countries being in the Middle East, parts of East and Southeast Asia, and then former Soviet states. And here again is the long-term trends. On balance, we find that all regions except Africa experienced a decline in democratic accountability from 2000 to 2021. Somewhat minor and varying differences, but I won't go through them specifically. And then finally, on to state capacity. Overall, we noticed in the data that state capacity scores tended to be lower than both public goods provision and democratic accountability. This is exemplified by the relatively few countries that scored among the highest values in the index. The ones that scored the highest here are typically the ones that also scored higher on the two other indice measures. Middle scoring countries span the globe, but there is greater presence represented from North America, parts of Europe, East Asia, and Latin America. And then, of course, we find the countries with the lowest state capacity scores are located specifically in Africa, Central, South, and Southeast Asia, and then Eastern Europe. And then here's the plot over time. Again, we find that Africa has made the greatest improvements, though still ranking at the bottom of all regions. And then Asia, Europe, the Americas remain largely the same, with a slight more impactful or notable decrease, specifically in Oceania. All right, so now to take a little bit of a closer look. Since we've seen how countries performed across individual indices, we're going to focus now on government performance across multiple indicators at the same time. As you can see on the X and Y axis, this particular plot is going to centralize or is going to locate items based on the respective scores of democratic accountability and state capacity. The dots are going to be sized specifically on their scores in public goods provision. One in the year 2000, and then the other one will be in 2021. We also include the average or the global averages as demarcated by these lines here. And we're going to do this for two regions, though in the actual report we do this for a lot more country groupings. So in this plot, we show changing government dynamics among select Eastern European countries, all of which belong to the European Union. A vast majority of these countries, as we can see, are located in the upper right quadrant, indicating above average democratic accountability and state capacity scores, along with very high scores in public goods provision. That said, there are divergent patterns, even within this relatively small group of countries. So first, we find that the trajectories of Latvia, Estonia, and Romania support the idea that enhancements in democratic accountability and state capacity are strongly associated with increases in public goods provision. We observe the size of the dots increasing alongside these diagonal upward movements. Yet, at the same time, there's a second grouping of Eastern European countries, specifically Poland, Hungary, Slovenia, and Bulgaria, that experienced declines in democratic accountability and state capacity, yet maintained increases in public goods provision. And this kind of exemplifies the pattern or the puzzle that we've been searching or trying to answer in this report. And then to give another example, focusing specifically on Asian countries, first we observe that there's greater variation in terms of the quadrants that these countries are located in. Most notably, a majority of these countries started and remained well below the global average in terms of state capacity. And focusing specifically on this group, we find widespread democratic backsliding. This is especially the case in countries like Thailand, Cambodia, Bangladesh, and the Philippines. Yet, as noted with several of the Eastern European countries, we find that these countries still exhibit increases in, or dramatic increases in public goods provision. And there's also a couple outliers in this selection of countries. Specifically, South Korea and Japan remain largely stable with average scores across all three, or with above average scores across all three indices. And then Singapore is similarly well positioned in terms of state capacity and and public goods provision, but not so much in terms of democratic accountability. And as we'll see, Singapore maintains or is one of the consistent outliers in our data. So to further explore the governance puzzle, since we've looked at the indices individual, and then focusing specifically on state capacity and democratic accountability, though public goods provision was also included, we're going to take a more dynamic approach in which we use a machine learning model to cluster countries based on the combinations of their scores to create groupings that make them unique and different from other clusters. So the 4 clusters we're going to identify and I'm going to speak about briefly are displayed there. And we'll start first with the successful, or what we call the successful democratic states. As we can see in the plot on the right, these countries are pretty much largely characterized by consistently high scores across all 3 indices. They are notably higher than all clusters. We can see on the bottom left, the bottom right for you, that Singapore remains the exception in this group, having a comparatively low democratic accountability score. Some characteristics of this cluster include having the highest average GDP, being the most globalized, and being the most politically stable. For more of these details, we can refer to the PowerPoint later. We don't have time to go through all of it. So that's the successful democratic states. Moving on to the second cluster is what we call the successful autocratic and illiberal states. And these are the countries that are exemplified by the technocratic sufficiency thesis. The countries in this cluster typically have lower scores in democratic accountability when compared to global averages, but they perform generally average or slightly below average in state capacity. We can consider them successful in the sense that they're able to provide public goods relatively well, more than what we would assume based on their scores. Some characteristics of this cluster are they've experienced the highest GDP growth over the last 2 decades. It's worth noting, though, that they rely heavily on oil rents, potentially to support this, and they have a notable economic inequality. Moving on to our third cluster, which we term the ineffective states cluster. This group consists of countries that typically demonstrate roughly average levels of democratic accountability and state capacity. Worth noting, however, is that at the same time, they aren't well able to provide public goods in a way that we would think that they would, given their democratic accountability and state capacity scores. Thus, we consider them ineffective in this regard. This cluster is characterized by weaker, or just being weaker economically, having some reliance on foreign aid and oil rents, etc. And then to move on to our last group of countries, we consider these countries struggling states. Some examples of these states include Nigeria, Guatemala, Cambodia, and Egypt. We refer to them as struggling because these countries typically exhibit poor performance across all 3 indices. And as we can see on the left, there's a couple reasons that might underpin this reality. Specifically, they have the lowest GDP per capita compared to all the other clusters we've gone over. They have the highest reliance on foreign aid, and then they have a high number of armed conflicts that can undermine their democratic or their governance success. And now moving on to varying trajectories for democracy, Professor Onheier will take over again.
Thank you, Joe. So what does that all mean, you might ask? We see as you can see in the plural trajectories, that we have very distinct trajectories for democracy or the possibility of democracies, depending on these clusters we could identify. Each of them faces a particular set of challenges, and we will speak to those briefly. In the successful democratic states, yes, there is a certain stability, but they're facing certain headwinds, and we argue that the challenge in these successful democratic states has to do with what Ralph Dahrendorf and Danny Roderick identified as a trilemma between having a globalized economy and open up the market for international trade. That has a tendency to impact social cohesion and domestic democratic accountability. And Dahrendorf already said in 1995 that the biggest challenge developed market economies, liberal market economies have in the 21st century is to square the circle between more open trade and globalization, domestic cohesion internally, right, and having a liberal order in terms of a political system. We think that countries can relate to that, can address it, and I will get back to that in my concluding comments. So the successful autocratic and illiberal states, here you can say, well, they really benefited a lot from globalization, in part because they are able to exploit the interdependence with the West. But if you look closely, virtually all of them rest on a particular business model that is either based on excessive trade surpluses, think about China, or rents, like oil rents and the Russian case of extractive industry. So there's no evidence, except Singapore, that a country in the long term can be a successful autocracy. Right? The ineffective states, here really democracy hangs in the balance. And they are in danger of losing the advantage that democracy gives to having adequate state capacity and public goods provision. And you could say that they're going back and forth. And is that a problem? Yes or no? And I'll speak to that as well in a moment. So they can make advances, but they tend to fall back. Right? And that's a typical sign of what we have in less developed countries. They are less able to withstand crisis and are more fragile and less resilient in keeping state capacity and public goods provision high. And that's what you could see in the data. And then we have the struggling states. Can they escape that vicious cycle of having low levels of democratic accountability, low state capacity, and low levels of public goods provision? How do they get out of there? We think that they can have a policy or a strategy of small increments. Right? They're unlikely to jump in significant ways forward. So we asked ourselves very, very challenging questions. And with the help of the Berggruen Index, we hope that we can answer some of them. So the first one is, do our results give cause for concern, especially for the successful democratic states? Yes, right? Because we know that small declines in democratic accountability can lead to further declines. And you can get on a slippery slope. It's called democratic backsliding. Hungary is a very, very good example. Right? But we also see that you can reverse the trend. It's not captured in our data, but the 2023 elections in Poland suggest that even if you go a long way towards being an illiberal democracy, you can still turn it around. And yes, we should be concerned for another reason, because once state capacity and democratic accountability start declining for the longer term, that can lead to a tipping point. And we think that the US is going to be the litmus test here in the years to come. No, we shouldn't be concerned, because even though there is a perception of crisis, most of the countries, particularly among those that are very high across all three indices are relatively stable, even though they're not on the upswing. Right? So if we have low democratic accountability and countries can increase public goods provision, is democracy less relevant? And here again we have two answers. Yes, at least for the medium term, it seems to be less relevant for some groups of countries, in particular for the successful autocracies. Right? And yes, they have a business model. Russia has a business model. The Emirates have a business model that seems to provide a stability. But there are assumptions built into that. And we say, no, democracy is still relevant because these autocracies are actually not as efficient as the successful democracies. And that's what the data tell us. So Russia is a very inefficient country in the way it uses its resources. Right? And then we also think that the business model is so specific to these countries that, and they're typically in niches, right, that it's difficult for other countries to copy that. Right? How many Singapores can there be and how many Russias? So there is a limited space for successful autocracy. Right? But can these, at least in the medium and short term, be a model challenging the Western approach? And here we think that this is the case, and that is where the true challenge to democracy is, because you could say that for the countries in the ineffective countries and the struggling countries, they're looking for models, right? And if China and Russia and the Hungaries of this world manage to, in a way, sell themselves, as they are actually trying to do, as an alternative to the Western way, that is the true challenge of democracy. And we make a very strong plea in the report that we in the West have to get our act together, so to speak, and become far more proactive in showcasing, if you wish, democracy. And we have been far too hesitant to do that. But is there a clear way for these ineffective and struggling states forward? Very likely not. Right? We will have to come to terms with the fact that many of the countries that are struggling today will still struggle in the future. Even though globally we see an increase in public goods provision. Right? But is that sustainable in the long run? And for the countries in the ineffective and struggling states cluster, we are reminded of Al Hirschman that the path to progress can be slow and full of contradiction, but it's still a path that makes advancement possible. And I leave you with this beautiful quote from Hirschman. He says that we have to learn, we in the countries in the struggling cluster and the ineffective cluster, we have to learn to sail against the wind, right? To make advances towards one goal, even if it means that we are jeopardizing something else. But this is, in fact, how the successful democracies developed, very often sailing against the wind. So we're calling for a new realism, right? We're not saying democracy is doomed, right? And we're also not saying that we should have the kind of relive the optimism of the 1990s. Right? We have to be more realistic that democracy is more or less alive and well in some countries, it is struggling in others, and it's unlikely to happen in yet other cases as well. Right? So I think we have to acknowledge the limits of democratic development in autocratic countries, and by the same time make sure that we know how to engage in democratic renewal in countries such as Poland that seem to be coming the other way again. So this is where we are. I'd like to thank you for your attention and want to stress again that we need to have a new realism when it comes to the future of democracy. Thank you so much. and I'd like to ask our panel chair to come up.
And I'm asking my panel to join me right away. So in the interest of time, we can get started with our program. My name is Alexander Liebe, and I'm Deputy Director of the Global Center for International Relations. And very happy to be here today. Thank you very much. And very happy to be here with a really fantastic panel. I will briefly introduce everybody, and then each panelist will give short remarks. I will ask questions or so, 2 questions, and then we open it up for Q&A with all of you in the room. Let me start with Jody Hyman. Jody Hyman is the founding director of the World Policy Analysis Center, leading an unprecedented effort to improve the levels and quality of comparative policy data available to policymakers, researchers, and the public. She was also dean of the UCLA Fielding School of Public Health from 2013 to 2018. Next to her is Michael Stover, who is a distinguished professor and an esteemed economic geographer who has spent his career at UCLA and London School of Economics and Chelsea School in Paris. Stover is a frequent contributor to regional and urban policy making for the European Union and other international agencies. Next is Georgia Cornell, who is assistant professor in the Department of Communication and Political Science here at UCLA. Her research interests include political communication, parties, behavior, European politics, comparative democratic institutions, and research methodology. Last, certainly not least, Brian Lee. He worked with the World Bank from 1989 in the old New York to 2012, where he focused on interactions between governments and deployment. After leaving the World Bank, Brian taught international development at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University, and he was the founding academic director of the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance at the University of Cape Town. Today, he's also a lecturer here at the UCLA School of Public Affairs. Jody.
Thank you. What a joy to be here with all of you. For me, the analogy that comes to mind when we think of this index that maps the world are the global maps we used to have of geography. So if you haven't looked up, do look up what the world looked like in 1500. It's kind of big blobs of continents. And then it gets a little better by 1600, a little better by 1700. And by now we have GPS maps that we can do within 10 feet. I do think the BGI is a giant step forward, not a small step. And I think that giant step is because of the conceptualization of we have to care about democratic accountability, we have to care about state capacity, and we have to care about public goods provision. I also think we still have a distance to travel. So that's not surprising. And we should both celebrate all we're learning and think about what's next. What don't we know yet? So what's an index need to do? It needs to do, or what could it do? How can these be used? They can be used in 3 ways. 1, describing where countries are now with accuracy. And I think that's where this index is a particular leap forward. The second thing indexes can do is predict where countries will be. And I still think we have a ways to go on that, and that is our next challenge. And the third thing they can and should do is guide governments and leaders on how to improve. So I'm going to focus on those 2 last areas because I think they're where the steps we need to take forward are. Okay, so why would I say that we have this great measure of where we are, which is the analogy to the maps is true. It's so much better than what we knew, but still need to go further in our ability to predict what's next. Well, Sudan on the index between 2000 and 2019 was the top performer in improvements. went from 19 to 42.8. I think those were real improvements. But in 2023, there's a civil war, 6.5 million internally displaced, 2 million who have fled as refugees. Myanmar was another top performer in improvements between 2000 and 2019, from 8.9 to 59. Also, by the way, undoubtedly deserved if you look at where it was in 2000 versus 2019. But we've seen what happens, and on the index it does drop. So my recommendation on that, on predicting, is that we need to accompany this with more understanding of inequality within countries. So the index does have measures under social good provision for gender equality and economic equality, but we need to add to that religious inequality, racial inequality, other dimensions, inequality in democratic accountability, who can really vote, who can come out. Those can be done, and I think those will help us do more predicting. I said the third thing an index can do is guide where countries can go. And I think this terrific conceptualization that BGI is and all the areas it covers could be a guide. Right now it measures where countries are. We need to map that with what levers policymakers can pull. What's a policy they can change, a law they can pass, a program they can implement at national scale that will make them more democratic, that will improve their state capacity. How do we do that? If we overlay this information on what they can do with how they're performing, we can get lessons on where they can go to improve. So I'm just going to conclude where I started, which is to say, thank you for this incredible mapping that has taken us, and thank you to everybody who's made this possible and worked on it, taken us so much further. And to say the reward for success should be more work. And I think that next stage of work is really understanding how inequalities within are leading to countries falling apart, and second, what are the big changes that governments can do? Measure them. Are they working? Do they lead to improvements so we can give people better tools for change? Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Am I next? Oh,
We're going
right. Okay.
in order.
All right. Well, I was asked to contextualize the findings for the European cases. And I think we can broadly consider, obviously, two buckets of European cases. One, the Western European ones, and the other, broadly speaking, the Eastern European ones. The latter, of course, have much higher incomes and better structural factors compared to the former, who are still in post-Soviet transitions. But a common factor in both of them is the rise of populist, anti-European, anti-globalization parties and their probable significant gains in the upcoming European Parliament elections this June 6th. These parties all have illiberal tendencies, so they're closely related to the democracy-challenged theme of the report we're discussing here. So we should ask why such movements seem to be gaining traction in these two European cases. Western Europe, where the mix of state capacity and public goods is the highest in the world, combined with the lowest inequality levels in the world, and this should lead to high levels of approval of democracy, or at least some stability in that. And Eastern Europe, where very rapid progress in incomes due to integration with Europe for EU members has generated large gains in per capita income, and European Cohesion Fund investments have generated large increases in public goods. Now, for Western Europe, my guess is that the missing element has to do with what Jody Heyman just referred to, which is rising income and spatial inequality. But these are kind of hidden in a lot of the numbers. There's also a cultural and moral panic about immigration. So many of you may know that Gini coefficients on income in continental Europe show income inequality on average to be 7 to 10 points lower than in the Anglo-American countries. The lowest are found, as you would expect, in the Nordic countries plus France. But even in these most prosperous and redistributive continental countries, there's a hidden story, and it's twofold. On the one hand, there's the rise of upper tail incomes, and though they are statistically canceled out by compression upward of the incomes at the lower part of the labor market, it means that actually on the ground, the lived experience in Western Europe is a lot of new positional inequality in daily life. The ability of the highly educated, high-income people to buy their way around the less successful parts of the public goods world. In addition, the income inequalities are sharply spatial, and especially interregional. As here in the USA, there are separate worlds emerging of super prosperous metropolitan regions full of young and educated people, and other regions that are generally older, more rural, more small town, lower income, and more socially conservative. So my first observation is that the trilemma-based model of the report could be interacted with inequality dynamics. But descriptively as controls or instrumental variables, that's kind of the technical side. But, and even possibly in attempts at kind of digging deeper into causality when we put these dynamic aspects of these societies in play. And it would show, I think, how show more about the relationship between state capacity and public goods to democratic accountability. And it's kind of is mediated by these internal inequality dynamics. Now, in Eastern Europe, post-Soviet countries have enjoyed this astounding progress in the past 2 to 3 decades. And with the substantial increases in public goods, we might ask, well, why the backlash? You know, what's wrong in these countries that are doing, from the outside, very well? My instinct goes to a fairly typical crisis of modernization. You know, in the Soviet world, there was high state capacity, including high state repression capacity, but also lots of public goods, albeit kind of shoddy ones. In the post-Soviet world, the transitions to democracy, they generate this paradox of states appearing incompetent, slow, ineffective in decision-making, you know, the messiness of democracy. And part of this, of course, comes from the inherited cultures and networks of corruption that were inherited from the Soviet era. But part of it's also just incomplete learning and institution building, you know, in this, you know, new world of democratic institutions. And of course, there's also an overlap with Western Europe in inequality trends. Soviet world was poor, but rather egalitarian, except for the state elite. Today, the new market-generated inequalities in Eastern Europe are both educational and spatial. Educated elites in dynamic metropolitan areas are the winners. And coming in the midst of this economic transition where per capita incomes are still far below those of the West, between 1/4 and 1/2 of the Western part of the EU, being on the losing side is much more disappointing in absolute terms than in the West. So putting it together, it seems like there's like a middle governance trap. And that kind of echoes this concept we have from development studies of the middle income trap, right? That it's kind of easier to develop if you're really low income or high income, but pretty hard to get through the middle. And I think the report argues cogently that high authoritarianism and high public goods can work. And on the other hand, high democracy and high public goods, along with high state capacity. But these transition countries, they find themselves in a confusing sort of middle ground consisting of moderate state capacity undermined by corruption, moderate or unequally distributed new public goods that are different from the old public goods in many ways. And so these features generate a nostalgia for a sanitized past, you know, kind of culturally comforting the substantial numbers of relative victims of a transition that is just entering its adolescence. In any case, I think that this style of thinking might help us in using the excellent framework that is put forward in this report for analyzing dynamics and maybe going in a more causal direction. So I think this is just a fantastic new kind of information that we can use as social scientists in understanding these dynamics. And I'm really very, very, very happy that you invited me to be part of this. Thank you very much.
Georgia.
Hi. Okay, so first I want to start by just saying thank you for raising this really important question. I actually think it's the most important question that people in my field are looking at right now, which is what's happening to democracy. And as a comparative politics scholar, I've found that quite a few of my American politics colleagues are finally interested in what we're doing. So I want to just stress the importance of this index and this question and the beginning of many answers to the question. So I want to say that it should come as no surprise that an autocracy can more efficiently and effectively deliver public goods to its constituents. So imagine a benevolent dictator. There's no legislature with competing parties to wrangle with. There's no coalitions to negotiate. The time and the resources of all these negotiations in democracies are not negligible. Indeed, a large share of the resource pie is spent on deliberations, on trial and error, on experiments. So if we imagine that Joe Biden didn't need to seek re-election and he could implement his ideal point, so to speak, I imagine many of us would be very happy with his policies, performance, and public good provision. But yet we don't want him to have, full control, right? We want there to be this possibility that he loses in the next election, even if it's to Donald Trump. And of course, I say we, but some of us may feel the opposite and may have felt that Donald Trump was performing best. And hopefully many of those people also wanted to have that next election and the potential for him to lose. And so the key word in that statement, that it should come as no surprise that an autocracy can more efficiently and effectively deliver public goods to its constituents, is that word can. It's important for us to remember that a democracy is going to have a lot of errors, as Hirschman pointed out in his quote, and that we're going to see, we have the ability to experiment with different policies in a democracy and then take those policies right back if we're not happy with the leaders who implemented them, take away the leaders and then potentially the policies. And so one thing that I just want to emphasize is that it's important, as my colleagues just mentioned, to really look at the variation within democracies as well as across the different groups of countries that we're looking at here. And so I also wanted to emphasize the importance of looking at economic inequality, because as we see the increase in public goods provisions, it doesn't actually mean that there's greater equality across the different economic levels. So what does explain democratic decline when it does exist? I think that's an important question that we must ask ourselves, and I don't have an answer to it, but I have one suggestion of an area that we might want to look at more, and that is to think about the importance of the media. So I just want to give state three quotes to remind you of how important the media is. Okay, from Thomas Jefferson, quote, "Were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter." Okay, from Katharine Graham, "News is what someone once suppressed. Everything else is advertising." And from John Lewis, "Without the press, the civil rights movement would have been a bird without wings." And I think it's important that we think about the role of the media and that it's having in all of these countries at this moment, and how it's changed over time. So when we look at what's changed across all countries, but especially across democracies from 2000 to 2021, one of the most significant differences over this time, I think, concerns the role of the media. Today's public in democracies receives their news from more diverse sources than ever before. People under 30 are more likely to report receiving news from social media than traditional media, and people over 30 are not that far behind. We're seeing much greater selective exposure than ever before as well. And by that I mean people seeking out specific media that confirms their beliefs. They're able to do so with the advent of new technologies like social media, but also like cable news, which really came on the scene in the late 90s. And so I don't actually have a solution, but I think that the change in the media environment is an important potential conflict for democracies and also a challenge. Certainly democracies don't want to limit the media. As we just heard in those quotes, none of those people would advocate for that. But thinking about how to perhaps advertise democracies in this new world, in this new environment, I think is an important question. And I also think it may lead to the rise of these right-wing political parties that Michael just pointed out as well. Thanks.
Thanks to the organizers for including me in this panel. Here's the argument that I want to make. First, I want to begin by saying yes to two core points suggested by the Berggruen Index in Helmut's presentation. Yes to the governance triangle, to considering together democracy, state capacity, and delivery. And yes to an implicit message to beware of the hubris of good governance maximalism, whether that good governance maximalism is of the democratic or the autocratic varieties. But having said that, I think the implications of this in terms of how to go about governance reform are far more far-reaching than the presentation suggests. Specifically, I think the results challenge us to move beyond a one or another normative preoccupation with best practice and to look much more deeply at how change actually happens in complex systems characterized by punctuated equilibrium. And that kind of change has two aspects. First, for long periods, it calls us to embrace what I'll call context-specific incrementalism. And then second, we also need to think much harder than we have about a second aspect of punctuated equilibrium, the points of inflection and the discontinuous change. And I'm going to elaborate on these by drawing on two sets of experiences. My experience trying to help mainstream governance reform into the World Bank, and my work in South Africa over the past decade. So let me begin with the World Bank. And the story at the World Bank can be summarized by an ongoing tension between a best practice way of engaging with reform versus a pragmatic way of engaging with reform. Just to set the stage, in practice, the World Bank is a much more pragmatic organization than the image of a neoliberal bastion dominated by neoclassical economists might lead one to think. Just to give you some examples, the bank worked closely over multiple decades with many non-democracies, notably including China and Vietnam. It also worked closely with Ethiopia, about war in a moment. Second, it became, over the course of the decades in which I was working there, increasingly comfortable speaking the language of institutions. And third, it was also open to experimentation in a variety of different ways. And there's a giant but coming here, of course. I mean, over the period of 15 years, I was centrally involved in trying to mainstream governance reforms in the bank, with a particular focus on what I've called context-aligned incrementalism. I wrote a book about that experience. It wasn't called Tacking Against the Wind, but Working with the Grain. But the themes, I want to flag two themes and two lessons that a year later I learned from that experience. The first one, context-aligned incremental approaches do not come easily. Technical professionals are preoccupied with the expertise that we think we have. And I witnessed over the course of my decades there continued contestation and continuing ambivalence around this tension between incrementalism and best practice. And frankly, it's a pendulum, and it's a pendulum that's been has swung back. To make my second point, I want to highlight two of the countries that I featured in the book. They were Ethiopia and Bangladesh. I featured Ethiopia in the book, and particularly it was Ethiopia during the period of Meles Zenawi, as an example of successful rapid development in the dominant context. And I featured Bangladesh in the book as an example of successful rapid development in a society that was largely open, incredibly messy. It was rated among the world's most corrupt countries, but also achieved extraordinary gains in a variety of social indicators. But here's the thing about these two countries. Both of them, in the last half dozen years, stopped evolving incrementally and found themselves in the midst of major discontinuous shocks that reshaped their trajectories of change. And that brings me to the second conclusion from the work at the World Bank. Neither best practice nor incrementalism are up to the task of navigating change in complex systems. We need to think much harder than we have, not only about how change happens in these periods of stability, but we need also to think about the points of inflection and discontinuous change. So how to think about these discontinuities. There, in some recent work, I've also, I noted, Helmut, you ended with Albert Hirschman. I've also taken inspiration from some of Albert Hirschman's work, but it's his work on the changing tolerance for inequality. And let me read you a quote for him from that work. What he said was, he said, and read this quote, critical is listen to the implicit centrality he gives in this quote to the role of ideas, the ideas that people have about what's going on in the world and what's going on in their lives. Tolerance for inequality, he said, is like a credit that falls due at a certain date. It is extended in the expectation that eventually the disparities will narrow. But if this does not occur, there is bound to be trouble and perhaps disaster. So in my own recent work, I've used that to sort of explore what I call the Hirschman cycle, and I've applied it to 3 discontinuous transitions in the case of South Africa. The hopeful 1990s transition from apartheid to constitutional democracy, the hope to rage, souring of South Africa's rainbow miracle, and then taking a more forward-looking perspective, what it might take to move from rage back to renewal. 2 sets of ideas are key to each of these transitions. The first one are ideas about inclusion. The ANC came to power in 1994 with a promise of a better life for all. More than is often acknowledged, it actually delivered on that for 15 years. But by the early 2010s, that promise had reached its sell-by date, and the ANC failed to renew. Even so, I actually take a good news lesson from that experience around ideas about inclusion. What it tells us is that what matters is not equality per se, but a credible promise that things will get better. And it was the failure to renew that promise that truly mattered. The second set of ideas, and this is where I'm going to conclude, and it brings me back to a central theme, Helmut, of your talk, are the ideas that, and how they played out in South Africa, ideas about how the public sector works and the legitimacy of the public sector idea. And the key point here is this. South Africans across the ideological spectrum in that country have inherited a narrow, top-down, hyper-Weberian vision of how the public sector should work. That top-down vision has some virtues. It can be okay in delivering on standardized logistical tasks. However, at best, it keeps citizens at a distance. It became, in the South African case, increasingly rigid, increasingly unresponsive, and increasingly corrupt. And ultimately, it helped to fuel the disillusion by fostering confrontational dynamics between disillusioned citizens and a dysfunctional state. So in a certain sense, a narrow vision of what it means to build state capacity in that setting and a preoccupation with that without any openness became part of the problem, not part of the solution. So in some recent work I've been doing with a prominent South African activist, I've been exploring how more participatory approaches might help to both close the gap between citizens and the public sector and thereby improve legitimacy, and at the same time enhance rather than undermine effectiveness. This isn't easy, but in my view, addressing state capacity in a way that also speaks to a new vision of what state capacity might imply matters not only in South Africa, but more broadly for many democracies seeking to move beyond the downward rage phase of the Hirschman cycle. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You have all covered a lot of ground. I have one very quick question, and then I open it up for the audience. And that is, the report calls for new realism in terms of governance forms and the future of democracy itself. So if we think about democracy 2.0, if we think that in the long term, democracy is probably still the most satisfactory model, of governance we have, I would ask the four of you in brief words, can be adjectives, anything, a few nouns. What is the most important thing that needs to be kept in mind for people willing to engage in rebuilding democracy as it currently functions? Who wants to go first? Just very quickly, from your experience and in light of the report.
I'll just actually repeat my conclusion, because it was two. It's first is good enough inclusion, but it's secondly, we need processes that can help renew perceptions of the legitimacy of the public domain.
Thank you.
I would say that one of the most important things is that political parties are learning how to navigate this new world, and we see that parties themselves are changing how they're organized, how they respond to the interest of voters, and some are succeeding and some are not, and so exploring the rules within parties and the institutions that govern themselves is I think, a useful thing to examine.
And do you have an example of how they should do this?
Yeah, well, so in my research, I found that I look at how the parties are organized internally, so how they select their candidates, write their platform, choose their leader. And so some of you might be familiar with the Labour Party in UK's choice of Jeremy Corbyn, and then after Brexit, how many people asked for Corbyn to stand down. He had a no confidence vote overwhelmingly by his party, like 172 to 40. And his shadow cabinet resigned, and yet the membership in the party exploded, and a lot of people joined the party and supported him, and the party moved even further to the left and had no chance of winning the election as a result. And so that democratically organized party, I think, is indicative of democratically organized parties in general. The more democratic the party is, I find, the less successful it is at responding to the interests of its constituents. So I think that as we think about a democracy at the country level, it doesn't mean that all the institutions within that country should always operate in a democratic fashion. And so I think parties are adjusting their own rules and procedures to react to a public that is much less engaged in parties in general, but at the same time try to be effective leaders.
Good. Thank you. Michael?
Sure, thanks. There's a huge body of social science research across disciplines that shows that across the planet, actually, people respond to certain things almost identically, certain kinds of values. And the three that come to mind here are hope, meaning when people have hope, they're happier. So that's about levels versus change. Secondly, people like fairness. Humans are hardwired to be very sensitive to the idea of fair versus unfair. And third, humans love the idea of freedom across societies. Now, there's a very interesting recent book by our own Dan Treisman here at UCLA called Spin Dictators, which he wrote with Serge Guriev. And they show very interestingly that the new brand of autocrats in the world, unlike the ones of the 20th century, which used heavy repression, and heavy repression alienates people, but the spin dictators, as the book is called, are good at the spin. And I'm picking up on your point about media, which is they've learned to use the language to, in fact, sort of co-opt the language of democracy and hope and even freedom in very effective ways. So this is a new challenge, right? So on the objective side, how to get hope, fairness, and freedom, but on the more subjective or constructivist side, how to get the narrative. And I think that echoes Helmut's point that in the democratic world, we probably need to also get a better spin game on.
Thank you. Jody?
So you might think that the four of us coordinated in some way, that we all mentioned equality, but there was actually no coordination, there was coordination of the event, but of our talking points, and no sharing it before. So the two things I want to say, and this does link both to what Brian was saying of whether everybody believes that they are going to get to an equal place, and what Michael was saying on fairness, are we have to get the rules right of the game, and they're not right yet in a lot of countries. So in a quarter of countries right now, it is still perfectly legal to discriminate on the basis of gender or sex in the workplace. I'm not talking about lack of implementation, perfectly legal. More have failed in other areas. If you look at sexual orientation and gender identity, it's overwhelming in the world that it is still legal. Migration, still legal to discriminate. So we have to elevate that floor of fairness, of hope, of equal opportunity. That's point one. The second, I think, gets to this issue of, and I'll circle back to Brian, believing that government can do good. And I'll say something about the United States. 186 countries have paid majority leave. The United States, one of the richest in the world, doesn't. Most high-income countries make higher ed affordable. The United States doesn't. When we have all these ways that people see government failing them in meeting basic needs, all parties should worry about this, wherever one is on the political spectrum, because faith in government does have to do, and that's why the goods provision part of this is so important too. Thank you.
Thank you very much, all of you. Open for questions. Who wants to ask a question? I know the first one is always hard. Helmut, do you have any follow-up questions
There's
after
one.
what you've heard? Oh, there is one?
This is a very simple question, but thoughts on AI technology and blockchain and how that plays into this?
I'll jump in if nobody else will. I mean, I think we have to catch up, right? Because for democracies to function, you actually need to have, this gets back to the newspapers, but you need to know whether what you're seeing is real. When we have the ability, when groups have the ability to automate with AI, creating so easily fake videos, fake sounds from voice, I mean, I think there's a whole piece we have to catch up on to save democracy, and there's enormous potential. There's all sorts of good that we could make happen. So, I think we need to engage before, but we have to hurry up and catch up.
Thank you. So I don't think you have covered this because the years you examined were just before that, but the globe experienced a global pandemic, and I'm wondering, and that's, I guess, a question for the two of you, do you anticipate differences because of the capacity of different countries to deal differently with the pandemic? Do you think that this is something that is going to upend the results or the trends you're noticing?
Okay. Any more questions?
I have two quick questions. One, I'm curious about the relationship between political authority, so states, governments, and an indexing exercise of this sort. One recent development is that the Indian government, which isn't doing very well in these reports, has actually sought the services of a domestic think tank to come up with its own democracy index, and one can assume how that will turn out. And so increasingly, it seems like these governments are getting really good at including such exercises as part of their kind of PR arsenal. So how do kind of sophisticated reports like this present themselves in public and also with other governments? Because if the aim is to have some sort of policy purchase, then I guess there needs to be an interesting negotiation with state entities. The other question is more kind of technical or conceptual, which is if we're thinking of a lot of social variables that are not accommodated in these reports, so how do how do people in Taipei understand state capacity as opposed to people in Beijing?
is there a way to include kind of this almost anthropological, local ideas about political authority into metrics like this? And if that's a useful exercise.
Do we have another question?
I do have a question. So, with regards to democracies and autocracies, and how you guys are saying that autocracies have been adopting the language of democracy. With regards to China, I think that they often talk about themselves as a democracy, and China, the ruling party in China is very popular among the populace in China, and it is referred to as a democracy within China by a lot of people. So how would you address that when they are saying, like, this works for China, the people support it, how is this not a democracy? How is this an autocracy?
Okay, I think last question for now, and then we're going to answer them.
Hello, thank you so much. So earlier someone was saying that struggling states should have a policy of small increments. And we saw that Africa over the period of 20 years was increasing across all indexes. So I wondered if there's proof of success of this small increment policy in Africa that we could learn from moving forward.
Yes.
One more question in the back.
Thank you. If you could touch on the relationship between education, formal and informal, between education and democracy, especially in developing countries. How do you encourage fostering democracy when education is not widely available, and critical thinking and stuff like that? Thank you.
Okay. All right. I'm going to go in this direction first. Who wants to take? What about the incremental changes in your direction? The interesting question is like whether the understanding overlaps between autocracy, democracy in terms of people's sentiment about what they're getting, and likewise whether it makes sense in that realm also to tailor terms to local understanding, local cultures. Any interest in taking any of this?
Can we just do a quick run of the different questions?
Yes.
Can we just pick?
Yeah, if you want to, take it.
Okay, I'll do super quick run of them. Anastasia's on the pandemic. It should inform us. I noticed that South Korea was ranked relatively low for the high-performing countries on state capacity, 72. Japan, 74. They both did beautifully in the pandemic. They both have top life expectancies. We should figure out what happened there, right? Some of the other countries like Britain, that 81 for state capacity, not so great in the pandemic. So I think there are a lot of lessons to learn. On this notion that every government has its own PR index, I want to say something positive, which is my experience going to give talks that show maps of policies in autocratic countries has been that in the audience there's somebody with their iPhone taking pictures, grabbing data, sharing it around. There are different strategies. I think these global data matters because it is now so easy still to share even in those settings. Last thing I want to comment on is education essential for democracy? And I'll say I was in a zone of conflict in Central America in the middle of a war with people who had a second and third grade education. who were doing mutual education on choice of governance, healthcare systems, pharmaceuticals. People can understand, and business trajectories. People can understand what impacts their life deeply without formal education, and there are good tools out there for how that gets done.
So we're just going to go, yeah, okay.
That's probably the easiest.
Let me just quickly riff on several of the questions. So the first one is pandemic. I think what surprised many of us is that even in the very high, sort of technically competent countries, that there was a lack of confidence, that we were caught unawares, that the public, even the kind of, obedient public, and even the kind of public like a lot of my friends who are highly educated and believe experts, but the amount of sort of worry it produced in us about, do the expert have it right? And are these rules right? Are the experts overly risk-averse or not risk-averse enough? What about the relationship between, the utilitarian goal of preventing disease and freedom? And we haven't worked that out yet. So I really think it's something that, when historians go over it and social scientists go over it, we've got to solve it because we're going to be hit by other major shocks like that. And the next one, I'm guessing, if we don't work it out, we're going to get incredible conflict about what measures we should take to protect ourselves. It took me a while to think about the AI question, but what I'd like to suggest is that, so I do a lot of I study technological innovation over time and its economic and spatial effects, and I think AI is going to be like that. And what we know about general purpose technologies is you get them, and they, of course, the good ones give us huge productivity boosts. And everyone says, this is what we want, it's the future, we're going to get richer and all that. But they almost always have huge new inequality effects that they produce in the labor market and in geography. And then and all these unintended effects like the public sphere, information, debate, and later on then we clean them up. In urban planning, that's what we do a lot is, we had the car, it kind of wrecked our cities, gave us all these environmental problems, and now we're trying to clean it up decades later. And AI, I think, is like that. It's very much, there's really amazing opportunities in it, but you can anticipate that there's going to be a lot of problems. And on China and the whole spin thing, I think you're exactly right. And that's what we don't here in the West have a grasp on is, those narratives, they work in a lot of countries. So we have to figure out why they work, and if we have a counter-narrative that can essentially work better, and I think we want to make democratic systems more attractive, and that's the challenge.
I'm going to stop us here because of time, and invite everybody, we'll have closing remarks from Neil Skillman from the Berggruen Institute, but we have lunch afterwards. I invite informal conversation because I actually would like for Helmut and Joe to answer also the pandemic question. So thank you very much for joining us for this part. Niels, the floor is yours.
Yes, there we go. I will be very brief. I'm the Chief Operating Officer and Vice President of Programs at the Berggruen Institute, and I just want to say, first of all, thank you very much to everybody who's been involved in the production of this report and previous editions of the report as well. That includes, obviously, the Luskin Center and the Hertie School as well. This has been a very important initiative for us at the Berggruen Institute. The Berggruen Institute is based here in Los Angeles. We've got offices also in Beijing and in Venice, Italy. And our central focus from the get-go has been about the intersection between governance and what we refer to as philosophy, which is trying to think of new ideas in a broad sense, not philosophy in a disciplinary sense, but philosophy in the sense of asking fundamental questions. And this index, which we've been collaborating on with Helmut and the rest of the team now for a number of years, is a really important part of this initiative for us because we really want to think in very specific and concrete terms about how learning happens across different institutions. There are, it's
there's a lot of evidence in these reports that some places are governed better than others. Why is this learning not transmitted effectively? What are the mechanisms to make those things more effective over time? Since the global financial crisis began 15 years ago, you would have thought that there would be lots of opportunities for learning. And there have been opportunities, but they've, for the most part, not been taken up. The panel at the end was discussing the pandemic. You would have thought this would be another opportunity for learning, but not so much. In fact, in many cases, the governance and trust in governance actually declined, particularly in this country. But in many countries, there's less respect for expertise and governance now than there was before the pandemic. We have a lot more to say about that. But let me just point out a couple of additional things that I think are worth highlighting beyond even what the excellent comments from the panel. One fundamental question is efficiency versus effectiveness. This is a distinction that's familiar to economists, but efficiency is about how do you get the result you're trying to do with the minimum amount of resources required. That's obviously an important thing for many purposes. But for many governance purposes, what people care about is not whether the government is efficient. They care about whether it's effective. Is it actually delivering the goods? Whether it's cost efficient is something that's largely invisible to the population. All they know is, is the education my child is getting good? Are the potholes being fixed? Are we winning the wars we're fighting? Whether those are cost effective or not, I think is a secondary matter. And I think that the question of effectiveness versus efficiency is something that's probably worth scrutinizing in greater detail. I think the panel was also very effective, even though apparently it was uncoordinated, to talk about inequality dynamics, especially but not exclusively economic inequality. And then the last thing I would just point out is that I think one of the things that I found very interesting reading this particular edition of the report in particular is that the question of the causal dynamics between the three primary dimensions, the state capacity, democratic accountability, and public goods provisioning, I think actually certainly it's a complicated one, but I came away from reading the report thinking that it's actually quite different. The causal dynamics, which is the upstream variable and which is the downstream variable, obviously there's circular causality between all three of the variables, but which one is the leading variable, the upstream variable, and which are the control variables, I think varies from one country to another. And I think it's possible, and we are seeing this in some places, that democratic accountability follows effectiveness, and sometimes it may lead effectiveness. And I don't think we can be deterministic about that. We need to get into specific details to understand how those things fit together. But in any event, I want to close quickly here by just saying thank you again. Thank you all of you for coming out for this report. We're hoping that this will get a lot of attention, and that the idea of the index, and I appreciated the comments about the utility of indices in general. I hope the index will be taken up broadly, and that we will see a lot more use of this kind of thinking, not only to better understand the legitimacy and democratic effectiveness dynamics, but also to guide policy so we can increase the performance of governments all over the world in all of these dimensions. So thank you very much for all that.
Thank you very much, Niels. Perhaps a few closing comments, and I want to address some of the questions. What is the takeaway that we have from the panel as the future of the index is concerned? Right? Quite clearly, you do not want to change an index every 2 months. Right? There has to be a certain stability to the index, and you have to be cautious in what dimensions are you going to add. Right? So an index always has to be parsimonious. You want to explain most with the least amount of variables and efforts. But I am increasingly convinced, Jody, that inequality is one of the dimensions that we need to stress. You can think of a certain level of equality as a public good almost, and maybe that's where it should be in a future version of the index. An index constructed where the state or the country is the unit of analysis is always lets you disregard some important domestic variations. And I think, Michael, your point about regional disparity is really well taken, and we may have to think about how something like that could be incorporated conceptually, analytically. I think the notion of the traps is very, very important. You said the the middle income trap. Maybe there's a middle governance trap that we need to look at more closely. Georgia, the media absolutely critical, and I'll say more about that in a second. Brian, the limits of incrementalism, we make an argument here for incrementalism, a very, very strong one. But then when you said punctuated equilibria and use terms like discontinuities, but you see, that may well be true, but from an index construction, that's very, very difficult to capture. Right? So we cannot say, well, there should be a revolution in a country like that. You see, that's not the way we think based on the index. Then, but we know from history, right, that most significant progress happens sometimes in a short period of time and through discontinuities. Revolutions are a very good example. And I'm struck, I'm not an historian, but I'm struck by the importance of looking at the long term. And now we look at 21 years, and maybe in 2 years when we have the 2026 report, we have 23 years. But if you sometimes need to look at 100 years to understand where a country comes from. And it's not only the importance of ideas, but also how discontinuities move a country forward. Now, this country, the United States, did not become a full democracy since the 1960s, right? And we forget that, right? We think we have over 200 years of democracy. No, we don't. Most of the time, it was a very limited democracy, right? Germany had excellent public goods provision when it was an autocracy until 1914, right? And so we forget these outliers. Are they outliers? I'm not so sure. So the pandemic, the question, I think what we will most likely see is a drop in state capacity. And the pandemic has revealed long underinvestments in public health efforts in many, many countries. We actually did apply the Berggruen Governance Index to how countries performed during the pandemic, the first wave of the pandemic, so 2020 into 21. And we could see that the index really helps us understand differences across countries, and also in terms of life expectancy. When it comes to Africa, there was a question, what is a good example? Two come to mind. One is for this kind of incrementalism. One is Botswana, and the other one is Kenya. These countries are, in fact, well on a slow but steady path towards improvement. Indonesia is not in Africa, of course, would be another country that has shown some progress. I want to close by pointing to, I think, what the panelists said and what we in the report also stressed, the importance of, you might say, an advertisement campaign for the virtues of democracy. Right? And there's an article in the current issue of The Atlantic by Anne Applebaum, and I'm not sure whether you've read it. I can only recommend reading it. And she argues very, very convincingly that the West is being, and democracy is undermined by a systematic campaign to talk down democracy, and that is advanced by countries like Russia and China. So the gentleman back there said, China thinks of itself as a democracy, right? And that is, in fact, exactly what we should not let stand. Right? So, but we're not engaging these audiences out there as forcefully and as smartly as we should be. So I think it's time for a new narrative for democracy. Thank you so much for coming. And if we have lunch served outside.